Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. We're going to begin the afternoon by hearing further evidence from one of the former employees of the Tenant Management Organisation.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I now call Mr. Peter Maddison, please.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maddison. Do sit down, make yourself comfortable. All right. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Maddison, good afternoon. Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations? We are very grateful to you. If you have any difficulty understanding my questions or you want me to ask the question again or put the point in a different way to you, I'm happy to do that. If you feel you need a break at any time, please indicate and we can take a break. We will take scheduled breaks halfway through the afternoon and halfway through the mornings that you're going to be giving evidence. The other thing I would just ask you to do, please, is to keep your voice up if you can, so that the person who sits to your right can get down everything you're saying onto the transcript. If you nod or shake your head instead of a yes or a no, that doesn't go onto the transcript. So if you would say yes or no, as the case may be, that would be very helpful. Now, you've made 3 witness statements to the inquiry. Can I please take you to them? They are in a folder on your desk, but they will also appear on the screen in front of you, as will all the documents to which we will be going together during the course of your examination. The first of your witness statements is TMO 50892. That's dated the 8th of February 2019. And if you go please to page 52, you can see that there's a signature there. Is that your signature?
It is.
I'm going to call that your first witness statement. Your second witness statement is at TMO 008473337. And that is dated the 13th of November 2019. And if you go to page 21, please, you'll see a signature there. Is that your signature?
It is.
And your third statement is TMO 008736688. And that's dated the 17th of June 2020. Is there a signature on page 2? If you go to that. Is that your signature?
It is.
And I'll call that your third witness statement. Have you read each of these witness statements recently?
I have.
And can you confirm that the contents are true?
I can, yes.
Have you discussed these statements or the evidence that you're going to give with anybody before coming here today?
No.
Now, Mr. Maddison, I just want to say something so that you and others listening to these proceedings can understand. At 16:40 on Friday afternoon last, Kennedy's, who are the TMO solicitors, told us that only that morning you had told them that you had hard copy notebooks in your possession at your home. Those notebooks were immediately made available to the inquiry, and disclosure to court participants has now taken place. I am going to be asking you some questions about how it came about that Kennedy's did not have those notebooks until last Friday, but I want to make it very clear to you right at the start of your examination, and also to those who are watching this examination, that I'm going to leave that topic until the very end of your examination on the substantive issues. The reason for that is that as we've been told, you've been advised by Kennedy's that you should have separate legal representation in respect of the matter of the notebooks and diaries, and that you've taken that advice, and that your solicitor, who will obviously be new to the inquiry, will need a little bit of time to be properly briefed on the question of the notebooks. And in any case, your new solicitor won't be familiar with the underlying material and would in any event not be able to represent you in place of Kennedy's on the substance that we're going to be discussing within the Module 1 timetable. So in order to preserve the timetable and to get your evidence, we will take it and then come to the question of the non-disclosure of the notebooks at the end, when your solicitor and new counsel will be here and able to represent you personally on that issue. Now, to be clear with you, in the course of your examination, we will be going to parts of the notebooks and diaries where we need to, just so that you understand. Now, I have a question. Subject to the notebooks and diaries issue, to which we will, as I say, return later, can you confirm that your statements, your three statements, are in substance a full, frank and candid account of your evidence on the matters relevant to the inquiry?
I can.
Thank you. Then I'm going to turn to the first of the substantive matters, which is your background, qualifications and experience. And can I start with your background? Is it right that you were the TMO's Director of Assets and Regeneration from the 21st of January 2013?
Yes.
Was that role your first role as a Director of Assets and Regeneration within a TMO or an ALMO?
I'd previously been an assistant director at a previous, at the Haringey Alma.
At Haringey ALMO, or ALMO. And you started, just to give the context or background to what was happening on Grenfell when you came in, the Grenfell Tower project had started. It was a separate project from the Kensington Academy Leisure Centre by then, yes?
That's correct.
And Leadbitter was the main contractor on the Kensington Academy Leisure Centre, or CALC project.
That's right.
And Studio E was the architect at that stage retained by the TMO in relation to the Grenfell Tower project.
Correct.
As well as the CALC project.
Yes.
Yes. And they had produced a stage D report. Was that right?
Yes.
Yes. Now, in your first witness statement, and we don't need to go to it, but it's at paragraph 11, you say that you had always worked in public sector housing. That's right, is it?
Yes.
Right. You also say that you have no housing qualification nor any technical qualification. Is that right?
That's right.
When you say housing qualification, what do you mean by that?
Any professional qualification related to housing, like the Chartered Institute of Housing.
I see. And when you say technical qualification, can you give us some idea about what it is?
I'm not an architect or a building surveyor, so I have no technical skills. My role has always been client side.
Right. So you're not a construction professional?
No.
In your second witness statement, and it's paragraph 3, but again, there's no need to go to it, you say, I had more than 20 years' experience of leading teams responsible for the refurbishment of residential accommodation prior to joining the TMO. Would it be fair to say that the roles you performed were focusing on managing housing and other property assets?
Yes.
Yes. Was a formal housing qualification necessary for you to perform your role at the TMO?
I don't believe so.
Right. So you were qualified, really, is this right, to the role you came into by your experience?
Yes.
And by nothing else?
That's right.
Yes. Was Mark Anderson your predecessor in your post?
He was.
And we have the date of your starting as the 21st of January 2013. At that stage, did you report to Sasha Jevons?
Yes.
And she, I think, was then the Director of Operations at the TMO. Is
That's
that right? And she, in turn, is this right, reported to Robert Black, who was the Chief Executive of the TMO?
That's right.
And when he arrived on the 25th of February 2013, did David Gibson report to you?
He did.
And his job title, I think, was Head of Capital Investment. Is that?
That's right.
That's right. Now, we're going to come on in due course to the detail of the scope of your role. But just for the moment, in broad terms, as Director of Assets and Regeneration, is it correct that you had oversight of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project?
Yes, that was part of the main capital programme that David Gibson's team managed.
Right. Did you receive any kind of handover from Mark Anderson?
Yes, I met Mark Anderson before I joined the TMO and took handover with him.
You say you took handover with him. Was there a handover meeting?
There were a couple of meetings. I met with Mark in the month or so before I joined in the January to go through key issues and to understand what was happening.
Right. And did you receive a briefing paper or handover pack of some kind that you could take away and study?
Not that I recall, no.
Right. And can you remember, and I know it's a long long time ago. But can you remember any key points that stood out from the handover meetings that you've described?
Well, Mark described the position that the team was in at that time, and he'd been an interim there for a little while, and he was putting in place a new structure, which the recruitment of my role was part of. So he described the rationale behind the structure and where he saw the priorities going forward, really.
Right. So that's the team structure rather than...
Team structure, but also the responsibilities that sit below those teams. So there had been a rearrangement of the structure there.
Now, I know that your portfolio that you were assuming from Mark Anderson encompassed a number of properties, projects and developments within the borough. Did you have any discussion about the Grenfell Tower refurbishment in particular during those meetings?
We did. I don't remember the level of detail that was in. I think that he described the situation in broad terms, but it was quite a complicated situation at that time. But amongst that, there were an awful lot of other things that were also happening in terms of the restructure of the team, but also in terms of putting in place programmes and delivering that year's capital programme, which was in January, was a priority to deliver that by the end of the financial year.
I see. Did anything stick out in your mind about what he said about the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project in particular?
It's hard to remember at this time. I remember him showing me some drawings which were on the wall near his office, and I knew that the project had stalled for a variety of reasons at that time, and so there were clearly issues to be addressed.
Right. During those handover meetings, did the subject of overcladding come up?
I don't remember specifically talking about it, but it was clearly illustrated on the drawings that were outside his office.
Was it? Okay. Now, if you go, please, to your first statement and look at page 1, I'd like to go to paragraph 3 with you, please. And you say that you were not a member of the TMO board nor a member of the TMO executive team. What function did the TMO executive team play?
Well, they were the executive directors on the board of directors, and the board was made up of a number of resident members and independents. They reported to, so the executive team were on the board.
Right. I see. So the executive team sat within the board as the executive members of the board.
That's correct.
And the other members of the board were non-executive. Is that the distinction between them?
Yes.
I follow. Now, is it right to say that from time to time you would attend TMO board meetings?
Yes.
Would you attend TMO executive meetings?
Yes.
Yes. So both. Yes.
Not always. Sometimes. Usually, just for a specific item. I wouldn't be at the whole meeting.
Okay. Can you give us some kind of idea about what sort of things you would attend TMO board meetings for?
I would generally take any papers that I was reporting to board or to operations committee to the executive team. So I would go regularly to the operations committee, but I would go to board less frequently, although quite regularly. Right.
Can we go to your first witness statement at page 2 then, please? So flipping the page and look at paragraph 7. And in the second line there, you say, the day-to-day project management of the refurbishment on behalf of TMO is managed and monitored by project manager Claire Williams, who succeeded Paul Dunkerton in that role in October 2013, reporting to the head of capital investment, David Gibson, until he retired in 2016. Now, we'll talk about the title of project manager in a moment, but just for the moment, I just want to understand the hierarchy. From your perspective at the time, how much of Paul Dunkerton's and then Claire Williams's time was spent on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment specifically? Start with Paul Dunkerton.
I mean, I was aware that I didn't manage Claire or Paul's workload very closely, and I struggle to remember exactly how much of their time, but they did run other projects as well.
Yes.
So it wasn't a full-time.
No. Not full-time. With Paul Dunkerton, how much would you say, looking back on it, how much of his time did the Grenfell Tower project occupy as opposed to other projects?
I mean, I can't remember really, but it was probably more than about half of his time, I would imagine.
Right. And from September 2013 and until the summer of 2016, what about Claire Williams? How much time of hers did Grenfell occupy?
I think it varied depending on the level of activity that was going on at any particular time. So when the project got onto site, it was much more intense, and Claire's role was probably much more.
And David Gibson, was he 100% of the time on Grenfell, or did he have other projects in his portfolio too?
No, he had a lot of other projects on his portfolio. So he was managing the capital programme as well as Grenfell. So Grenfell's probably, in financial terms, probably about a third of the overall programme.
Right. Going back to the distinction between the board and the executive team for a moment, can you clarify what decisions were to be made by the board as opposed to the executive team that sat within it?
There were certain levels of contract and values of contract that could be let by the executive, by the operations committee, and by the board. I can't remember exactly what they were, but larger scale programs would always be taken to the board for approval.
Right. So monetary decisions, or decisions that were governed by a monetary cap.
Well, certainly, yes, from the perspective of contracts, yes, but also there were also issues of policy and that were taken to board and to operations committee too.
And what were the limits of your authority to make decisions without needing to seek the sanction of the TMO executive board or the main board?
To be honest, that wasn't very clear to me, so I made sure that I always got executive sign-off or board sign-off as appropriate.
Right. You say it was never very clear to you. Does that mean that no one ever spelt out precisely what you could and couldn't do without authority?
I think there were levels of authority, but it was I always felt it was better and clearer to make sure that there was a sign-off from the executive.
Right. When you came into the job in January 2013, did anybody give you a job description?
Yes, I had a job description.
You did?
Yeah.
Did that not set out precisely what the parameters of your authority were? It didn't. Did you ever have cause to discuss with anybody at the TMO what the parameters of your authority were?
Yes, I did discuss it. And,
you did?
And it was, there were written descriptions of what the authority were, but I didn't think it was as comprehensive as I would have liked, so I always made sure that I was careful in delegating that responsibility.
Give us an idea, if you could, what sort of areas you thought it wasn't sufficiently comprehensive?
Just the specific. So, in terms of letting contracts, etc., I would always make sure that I got an authority from the executive in general.
But you mentioned a moment ago that you thought that the written descriptions of your authority weren't sufficiently comprehensive. So, what sort of areas did you think the written authority was insufficient in that respect?
Well, I think that within a programme or a contract, I think I would always look to get an approval for that contract, but within that contract sum, for example, there would be clear. I'd be able to award works within that contract sum. So I'd always make sure that there was a clear audit trail as far as possible between the decision making and the executive and the board. Right.
Can you give us some sort of monetary level or limit where you were completely clear you wouldn't need to seek anybody else's sanction when making a decision? Is there a figure you had in mind?
No, I don't.
And what sort of decisions would David Gibson be able to take without asking for your authority?
I mean, it's the same in a way. We always ensured that we got financial approvals through our board and through the executive team.
Right.
So we took reports up to be signed off there. Within individual contracts that were let, David would be able to award works within those values, within the approvals that were approved at the board.
Did David Gibson have a lesser level of authority than yours in monetary terms?
Well, I think that would make sense. But as I say, I don't think it was as clear as it could have been.
Right. And does the same apply to Paul Dunkerton and Claire Williams?
Yes. I think we all worked to the authorities that we got for the approvals of the contracts.
Right.
So.
But you can't help us on what the levels of authority for Paul Dunkerton or Claire Williams were?
No.
Nor, I think, David Gibson?
No.
Now, let's go to Mr. Dunkerton's first witness statement. That's TMO 60885, please. And I'd like to go with you to page 3 and paragraph 17. And in paragraph 17, you see he says, Peter Maddison was then appointed as Director of Asset Investment and Engineering, and he had a very clear view of how he wanted to manage the project. Peter almost immediately took over any involvement I had in it. Do you agree with that?
No.
Well, do you agree with none of it, or is there anything you do agree with?
I'd like to think I had a clear view of how I wanted to manage the project, but I didn't take over responsibility from Paul. When I joined the TMO, I'd previously appointed David Gibson before I arrived. We'd interviewed and offered the role to David. So David came along shortly after me, and David took on responsibility for managing Paul and the Grenfell Tower project. So it's inaccurate to say that I was taking on management of the project. My role was much broader, and I wasn't taking on day-to-day responsibility for this project.
Yes, I see. Thank you. Now, you, I think, do agree that you had a very clear view of how you wanted to manage the project. Is that at least correct?
Yes.
Yes. When you arrived at the TMO in the January of 2013, did you sit down and read the key documents relevant to the Grenfell Tower project?
No, I didn't.
Did you read Studio E's Stage D report from December 2012?
I don't recall. I certainly would have been in meetings where it was discussed. I don't recall whether I've read it in detail.
Right.
When I joined the project, I took briefings from each of the parties. So met with Studio E and discussed the project with them, and met with Artelia in particular, who gave a very sort of comprehensive induction into their view of where the project was and what the issues were.
I see. So you met Studio E, you met Artelia. Did you meet anybody else?
I'll have met others at project team meetings, but really Studio E and Artelia were the key parties that I discussed.
Right. Can you recall who the others were that you met at project team meetings?
I remember meeting someone from Max Fordham.
Yes.
And struggling to remember who else, to be honest.
Well, we'll come back to those early days later. Just staying with the question of Paul Dunkerton, we know from your first witness statement that Claire Williams succeeded Paul Dunkerton in September 2013. In fact, is it right Paul Dunkerton actually left earlier than September 2013?
I think he did, and I think there was an interim who helped out in between, I seem to remember. So.
Yes, and is it right that during the interim period, which I think was 3 months, that role was covered by Sasha Kulijan?
That's correct.
Right. So you had, is this right, so that I'm clear, you had Paul Dunkerton before January 2013,
yeah.
Up to June 2013, I think. He then left. There was then a 3-month period until September, where the role was occupied by Sasha Kulijan, and then Claire Williams took over as a permanent member of staff. Have I got that right?
Yes, I think that's right.
Thank you. Now, Paul Dunkerton was actually only ever a temporary employee, wasn't he?
He was.
Yes. So you had no permanent member of staff working primarily on the Grenfell Tower project between the time you arrived in January 2013 and September 2013 when Claire Williams arrived.
That's correct.
Right. Can we go to your second witness statement, please, at page 19? And I want to go to paragraph 86. And there you say, in the second line, I recall attending Claire's interview, that's Claire Williams' interview. However, I cannot recall the substance of what was said. My understanding is that there was a documented selection process led by David Gibson and supported by the Human Resources team. Claire will have completed an application explaining how her skills and experience met the requirements of the job description and person specification. Her skills and experience were tested through an interview process. Now, apart from attending her interview, what role did you have in the recruitment of Claire Williams?
That was the only role I played.
Right. Were you aware that she and David Gibson had worked together previously at Circle 33?
Yes.
You were. Were you aware of that at the time she came to be interviewed?
Yes.
Yes. Now, you say in paragraph 86 that the documented selection process was led by David Gibson. Did David Gibson recommend Claire Williams for interview?
I don't know that recommend is the right. I think he may have contacted her and asked her if she was interested in applying.
Right.
At the time, it was very difficult to recruit project managers, and so we tried on a number of occasions because there were a number of project managers within the team.
Right.
So yeah.
Do you know what the process was by which the applicants were selected for interview?
I don't recall.
Did David Gibson have a role in making that selection?
I don't recall. It would have been managed by the human resources team, and so David would have been working with the HR team to run that process. I can't remember how it was run. We did sometimes use external consultants to help us find project managers because it was a very difficult market.
Well, I was going to ask you, did you use external consultants or an agency in general in this recruitment process?
I don't remember this particular recruitment process, but it was a common thing that we did because it was a difficult market.
Right. Did David Gibson say anything about Claire Williams before the interview to you?
I don't recall, no.
Okay. Going back to, or sticking with paragraph 86, you say in the second and third lines that you don't recall the substance of what was said at the interview. Can you tell us whether she was or would have been asked about her experience in major works involving construction projects?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you remember whether she was asked about her experience acting as the client or employer in such projects?
Yeah, I think she would have done.
Do you know whether she was asked about her experience managing a project overcladding a high-rise residential building?
I don't recall that. I'm not sure whether this role was specific to, it wasn't specific to Grenfell Tower. It was a generic project management role. And I don't recall whether it was just the one post that we were recruiting to or it was more than one post.
No, I understand that.
But I don't recall there being specific questions around overcladding the tower block. No.
Right. At the time you were interviewing Claire Williams, do you remember whether you had an eye on her specifically for Grenfell or whether you were just interviewing her for a general role within the TMO?
I think we would have made the judgment based on who we recruited as to how we would allocate the various roles within the capital programme team.
I see.
So we were going to look at the strengths of the various candidates.
Right. So just to be very clear, when she was spotted, as it were, and interviewed, and at the time she was given the job, am I right in thinking that she wasn't interviewed and given the job specifically in relation to the Grenfell Tower project?
I think that's correct.
So the allocation of that project to her came at a later stage?
Yes, although David and I would have probably discussed it shortly after deciding who was the successful candidate from the interview process.
I see. When that allocation decision was made, obviously you say you were involved in that decision. Who else was involved in the decision to appoint Claire Williams to the role of project manager in respect of the Grenfell Tower project?
I think that would have been a discussion between myself and David.
What factors did you take into account in making that decision?
And we wanted somebody who had a strong track record of having delivered programs and projects from a client perspective, but we also wanted somebody who was really strong on managing resident consultation process and very keen on engaging residents and making sure they were involved in the process.
Would you agree that the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project was a complex one?
Yes, it was complex.
I mean, it was lengthy, it was major, and it had a number of different facets.
Yes.
And it also involved residents remaining in occupation throughout, didn't it?
It did.
Did you consider the relevance of the fact that Grenfell Tower, as part of the refurbishment, was going to be overclad when considering Claire Williams for the role of project manager?
Not specifically.
You didn't?
No.
Did you not ask her whether she had any specific experience in overcladding?
I don't think we did. I think the role was a more generic role than specifically looking for somebody with a experience of a cladding.
Yes. Now, going back to your professional expertise and experience, you told us that you don't have any technical qualifications. If we go to your first witness statement, please, we can look at paragraph 23. It's page 4, paragraph 23. You say there, although I had previously had some limited involvement with asset management projects that had involved cladding, I had and still have no technical ability or knowledge of either the materials used in cladding nor how they are required to be fitted. And if you go to your second witness statement, at page 11, we go to paragraph 51, you say there, while employed at Lewisham Council, I was involved in several cladding projects, including Hawk Tower on Milton Court Estate and some limited involvement on the overcladding of 2 tower blocks on Pepys Estate. In these projects, Lewisham was the client under a standard JCT contract. During my employment at Haringey Council, I was involved in the cladding of Trulock Court. This work was carried out under a design and build project. None of these projects used rain screen ACM, i.e. aluminium composite material. What was the cladding used, do you remember, at Hawk Tower?
It was brick and render.
And what about Trulock Court?
It was render.
Right, and what about the Pepys Estate?
And I think the Pepys Estate was a sheet aluminium, I believe.
Sheet aluminium,
Yeah.
so not ACM.
No.
Do you remember what the insulation used in the Pepys Estate system was? I'm assuming that it was a rain screen system as opposed to a rendered system.
To be honest, I don't know, and my involvement there was very limited. It was literally, I gave a small amount of cover for a period when the development manager for that role was vacant. Okay. So I covered the Hawk Tower project and the Pepys project for a short period of time. By that time, all of the material, most of the build was complete, really. So I didn't really get involved in the material detail at that time.
I follow. Now, obviously, your career before you joined the TMO spanned some 20 years. The list of projects that you've got here involving cladding at paragraph 51 is I think, only identifies some 3 projects or so. Is that the total list, the complete list of projects which you recall involving cladding during that period?
Yes.
Right. Now, you say that the organisation you worked for was always client in the projects. Would you say that what was expected of you as client in the Grenfell Tower project was similar to the projects you'd worked on before?
Yes.
Yes. And you say you didn't have any professional expertise with regard to building design. Do I take it from that you didn't actually need or think you needed any building design expertise in order to carry out your role either before joining the TMO or while at the TMO?
No, my role was always a commissioning role, so putting in place a professional team to deliver projects. So, So I would work as the client and with the client to develop the brief for the project, and we'd put in place professional teams to deliver them.
Now, just turning to the TMO's role as a client specifically, I just want to explore that issue a little bit more closely. Can we go back to your first witness statement, please, to page 8, and go to paragraph 43. And there you say, as client, TMO's role was to monitor and manage progress of the refurbishment work against budget to ensure delivery of the programme on behalf of RBKC, residents and leaseholders. Alongside contractors, its role was to liaise with residents to facilitate works within residential areas. TMO's role was also to report progress and budget to the TMO executive, TMO board and to RBKC. Is that a description of your role, or does it apply to everyone involved in the project?
I think it's everyone in the project. So the client role here was about dealing with internal stakeholders, our board, the governance, and specifically with residents.
Yes.
We would always put in place a professional team who took on the professional management of those contracts.
Right.
And the client team would be monitoring those contracts and reporting.
Now, you say that TMO's role was to monitor and manage progress of the refurbishment work against budget to ensure delivery of the programme.
Yes.
But do you accept that there were people within the TMO who were required to make decisions about design options?
There was a discussion. So yes, I mean ultimately there are decisions that the client will make, but will be made based on recommendations from the professional team.
Yeah. And do you accept that people at the TMO played, and we'll come to it, but in general, do you accept that people in the TMO played an active role in the design decisions which had an impact on the budget?
Yes, as part of the client, but taking recommendations and working with the professional team.
Yes. And that therefore the TMO's role in monitoring and managing progress against budget involved at least some decision-making about what designs to have and what materials and products to have.
I think that's... We would be looking for the professional teams to make recommendations, and if there are choices and options, then we would consider those.
Yeah.
But obviously, we'd be assuming that everything that is proposed it complies with regulation, and that the professional team has taken due diligence in making sure that the designs are appropriate.
Yes, I understand your position on that, Mr. Maddison. I'm just seeking really to understand with greater precision what you would accept about the breadth of the role of monitoring and managing progress of the refurbishment work against budget. Do you accept that the role as described there extends to making decisions about design and materials?
Yes, the decisions based on recommendations from a professional team, and we would consider that in the context of the budget available.
Yes. Now, you've made it very clear in your evidence just now, and indeed in other parts of your statement, that you relied on the professionals involved at various stages of the works.
Yes.
Let's just focus on that a little bit more closely. Can we look at your second witness statement and go first in that? There are two passages I want to show you on this point. First in that at page 5, and look please at paragraph 21 there. You say under the heading pre-contract stage summary, you say, in summary, in relation to the pre-contract stage of the project, I had no reason to doubt the professionalism or ability of any of the pre-contract professional team. And then sticking with this statement and going please to page 9, if you just go there, look at paragraph 41 with me, under post-tender summary. You say, it was not brought to my attention at any stage by any of the above-named professionals that any aspect of the design, planning or material selection was non-compliant with the current legislation or regulations. Would you agree that the position you're describing here, and indeed in the first passage I read to you from your statement, describes you requiring professionals proactively bringing faults or concerns to your attention?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. Are you, in this passage, and let's just keep it simple and stick to paragraph 41, are you saying that you relied on your professional team to bring to your attention any aspects of the design or planning or material selection that you say was non-compliant,
yes,
but that presented a difficulty?
Yes.
Right. And does that tell us that if they didn't bring anything like that to your attention, you assumed that everything was all right?
Well, there were checks in place at various times. So in terms of the structure of the professional team here, at various stages there were different leads. So, for example, in the pre-contract stage, Studio E were the lead consultants, and they coordinated the project. And in the post-tender process, the contractor took on responsibility, and we would be relying in that stage on the employer's agents to flag up any issues with managing our
Did you, and by you, I mean both you and the TMO as an organisation, actively monitor the professionals' work? For example, to check from time to time that the design professionals were performing their role properly?
There was a structure of review and coordination of meetings. So there was a structure of meetings where the professional team would meet and they would discuss progress and discuss specific issues. They were led by Artelia as the employer's agent. And within that, certain aspects that were challenging or needed to be explored would be interrogated by the professional team. So it wasn't necessarily just the client doing that. It was us relying on the professional team to work collaboratively at looking at what was needed to make sure that we complied.
Yeah, I think the broad thrust of what you're telling us is that you would rely on your professional team completely to make sure that there was compliance by you, the client. You wouldn't monitor them actively to make sure that they were doing their work properly.
Well, we would monitor them in the sense that they would produce reports and they would produce summaries of actions and financial reports. So there would be a whole series of documentation that would sit behind the project team, and that would be interrogated by the team and discussed. And so my team would be part of that process.
Now, I'd like to examine with you the TMA's relationship with RBKC, if I can. And I want to start with the Modular Management Agreement, or the MMA. And that is at RBK 3019006. There it is, this is its first page, Volume 1, the agreement. And if you go to the second page, at the top of page 2, you can see the date, 12th of June 2006, between RBKC and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation Limited, called the BWTMO. Do you know why it was called the BWTMO?
No, I've never seen that before.
Never seen it before. Have you ever seen this document before?
I've seen extracts of it. I suspect that it was a document that developed and evolved over time, and certain aspects would be developed. But I've never seen BWTMOs.
Right. I mean, did you know that in fact there was another MMA entered on the 26th of November 2015? Did you know that?
I may have done. I didn't.
We don't need to go to it. For reference purposes, it's RBK 3018796, but there's no need to go to it. Looking at what's on the screen in front of you, do you remember that this was the document which governed the relationship between RBKC on the one hand and the TMO on the other?
Yes.
Can we go to page 12, please? This is in Volume 1, within Chapter 1, Clause 4.2. And it's under the broad heading, Statement of Exercise of Management Functions under the Right to Manage. And under 4.2, the agreement says, nothing in this agreement gives the BWTMO any ownership or other legal rights or imposes any obligations in respect of the property, other than the right to manage and maintain the property. Nothing in this agreement affects the Council's legal relationship with its tenants or leaseholders, and the Council retains its statutory, contractual and common law obligations to them, and all other clauses in this agreement are subject to this clause. Was it your well, first of all, did you ever look at that part of the MMA?
I don't think I did, no.
In general terms, was it your understanding that the Council retained its legal obligations to the tenants and leaseholders of the buildings of which it was freeholder, as provided for in this agreement?
Yes.
Yes. Now let's look at page 35. In page 35, which is in Volume 1, Chapter 2, we see Clause 6, and this is entitled Major Works. And at 6.1 it says, the BWTMO agrees to enter into contracts for agreed major works and supervise such works if the Council has included a sufficient amount within the allowances for the BWTMO to carry out such works. Now, do you know, are you familiar with this provision?
I don't really recall, to be honest.
No. Are you familiar with the principle that the TMO enters into contracts for agreed major works and should supervise the works if the Council has included a sufficient amount within the allowances?
Yes.
Yes. What at the time, did you understand the obligation to supervise such works involve?
I think the TMO took on all responsibilities to supervise the role as the client on behalf of the council.
Would that include making sure that designers had the relevant experience
Yes,
and were properly appointed,
yes,
and that they weren't putting in artificially low figures that could never be achieved?
yes,
Did you understand that the obligation to supervise such works was a proactive role, in other words, actively to supervise?
yes,
This wasn't just assuming responsibility away from RBKC, it involved proactive work. You understood that?
yes.
Yeah. And presumably, is this right, to the best of your understanding, RBKC expected the TMO to take an active role in supervising the construction professionals in the delivery of their work?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we please have pages 81 and 82 of the MMA up together? At the top of page 81, we can see Chapter 7, and the title is Staffing and Management of the Relationship Between the BW TMO and the Council. And at the bottom of page 82, we can see Clause 4, which is entitled Employment of Contractors. And at Clause 4.2, if we just see that, it says the BWTMO will only appoint contractors who, if we go over the page to little a, have the capacity to do work required by the BWTMO to an acceptable standard of quality. Did the TMO have a system for assuring itself or satisfying itself that complied with that contractual obligation?
Well, there was due diligence carried out on the appointment of each contractor before appointment, and that would cover issues such as these.
So you say there was due diligence carried out on the appointment of each contractor before appointment. Are you satisfied that due diligence was carried out on each of the contractors that the TMO was engaging for the Grenfell Tower project before they were engaged on the Grenfell Tower project?
When you say contractors, do you mean consultants?
Contractors and consultants, you're quite right.
I was only involved in the due diligence on the selection of the main contractor, so I didn't have sight of what due diligence was carried out with the consultants.
When you came into the project, did you, either as part of the handover sessions that you've described or privately on your own, did you investigate what due diligence had been done into Studio E's fitness for appointment as architects on the Grenfell Tower project?
I didn't at that stage because when I arrived in the project, it was already at stage D, so at that stage the project had stalled and we were trying to move it on. So really, the only work that was carried out by the professional team at that stage was to take the project from stage D to stage E. So it was quite a limited amount of work. So I didn't have any cause. I took as face value that the due diligence had been carried out before I arrived.
Now, before we look at Grenfell Tower specifically, I want to ask you some questions about your fire safety knowledge and training. So it's a different topic. In your second witness statement, I think you answered some of the questions posed by the inquiry about what fire safety training you'd received. Can we go to that second statement and look at page 16? And I'd like to go to paragraph 72 towards the top of the page. You say, the TMO is a housing management organisation. During my employment there, I received general health and safety training. We were given updates on this training in the Health and Safety Committee meetings, which Barbara Matthews led and which I attended. In these meetings, we also discussed fire safety matters, such as amendments to our policies and updates on the progress of the Fire Risk Assessment Programme. However, wherever I have worked, it is not the role of the housing management organisation to be the technical expert. Now, did general health and safety training that you're referring to there include training on fire safety matters?
In overview, yes.
In overview?
Yes.
Can you explain what you mean by in overview?
It was a general health and safety training session which took up a day and looked at all aspects of health and safety in relation to health and safety at work, CDM, and fire safety and various other aspects, as I remember.
Right. Was the fire safety training that you described directed to how the TMO should deal with fire safety in its building stock?
It was more general than that,
It
really.
was more general than that, was it? What about its obligations under the Fire Safety Order of 2005, otherwise known as the Regulatory Reform Order?
I'm sure that would have been mentioned. I don't recall the content of the training in great detail.
Right. Was there anything ever given to you by way of training on managing fire safety in a residential high-rise building?
Not specifically, no.
Right. Does that tell us that when you took over oversight of the Grenfell Tower project, with your clear view of it, you had had no training on managing fire safety in a high-rise residential building?
That's right.
Now, you will, I think, say that you had updates on training at Health and Safety Committee meetings. Does that tell us that there was no formal updating or professional development course available on fire safety?
No, not that I recall.
So there was no formal updating or keeping you current about fire safety matters?
There were briefings that we received through the Health and Safety Committee.
And on that committee, would I be right in thinking that committee and through those meetings, you would focus on specific concerns or events relevant to particular buildings within the TMO stock?
Yes, but also there was a health and safety team who would give specialist support and advice, and we would bring in specialist advice as necessary throughout particular projects.
Yes. You say, if necessary, throughout particular projects. Did you ever engage the specialist support and advice of TMO's health and safety team on Grenfell?
At various points in the project, yes. There were certainly discussions with the health and safety team.
Yes, at various points.
Yes.
Can you tell us specifically?
Struggling to remember specifics. Certainly, we took advice from we carried out a fire risk assessment before starting the work and took advice from that. We also engaged the fire risk assessor that to consider certain aspects of the work at various stages when there were issues raised from residents, for example.
But I'm taking from your answers that you didn't think it appropriate or necessary to embed a member of the TMO's health and safety team within the TMO's Grenfell Tower refurbishment project team, so that they were there as a permanent resource.
I mean, the health and safety team was only a very small team. I think a team of 2 in the TMO, and I've never really come across a situation where you would have a specialist fire safety person within a capital programme delivery team. That hasn't been my experience.
Yes, I mean, I think is the position, it sounds as if it is, that the health and safety team would be consulted by the project team on an as and when basis if they perceived that expertise was needed. But there was no holistic overview by the TMO's specialist health and safety team of the project as it developed.
That's right, and we would also take advice from the professional team of any specialist advice they would need around fire safety or other health and safety issues. And obviously we had the CDMC role as well, where they would have a role in ensuring that we had the right advice and the right health and safety approach in place.
Leaving aside the health and safety team, were you aware if anybody at the TMO involved in the Grenfell Tower project had specific training in fire safety risks which were posed by the refurbishment works?
Not specific, but there was a regular engagement with the head of health and safety and various other bodies such as the fire risk assessor and the fire brigade throughout the development and delivery of the project.
You say regular engagement. Is that right? Were there regular updating meetings with the health and safety team at each stage of the project so that the health and safety team could have an overview or a holistic view of the Grenfell Tower project?
Well, I think it was mainly on site aspects. So I think that Claire Williams met with Janice Ray quite frequently on site and often brought along other specialists. So Carl Stokes, the fire risk assessor, and the fire brigades had regular familiarisation visits.
Yes, I see. But I think you were saying before that the consultations of the health and safety team would be essentially limited to things that Claire Williams would want to have their input on.
Yes, well, and a more broad overview of attending site and ensuring things seemed right. But yeah, they weren't involved. The health and safety team weren't involved in the day-to-day project management of the project.
I'm going to ask a different topic now. I'm going to ask you some questions about fires in residential blocks in the UK and what you knew of them before the Grenfell Tower project started. Can we go to page 11 of your second statement? This is statement number 2, page 11. And this is paragraph 52. And in the second sentence you say, I recall that the findings of the Lakenal House inquiry were referred to and considered by the TMO, as were the findings made in relation to the fire at Shepherd's Court. In relation to the Shepherd's Court fire, I recall being forwarded by Janice Ray a copy of a letter from the LFB entitled Tall Buildings External Fire Spread in April 2017. I recall discussing the contents of this letter with Janice Ray. However, my recollection is that the letter was referring to the risk associated with non-compliant cladding, and I understood the cladding of Grenfell Tower to be fully compliant with building regulations, as building control issued a certificate of completion. Now, there's a lot in there, but I just want to focus on the findings of the Lakenal House inquiry, as you put it. In fact, it was an inquest, or series of inquests. That's right, isn't it, technically?
I don't know.
You don't know? All right.
I accept your point.
Now, just to give you a bit of clarification so that we can put this in context, the fire at Lakenal occurred on the 3rd of July 2009 in what was a 14-storey tower block called Lakenal House, as a result of which there were 6 deaths. Do you remember that?
I do.
And the inquest into those deaths ended in the hearings ended in the January of 2013, and the coroner's Rule 43 recommendations were made on the 28th of March 2013. That's the background. And if we now go to a document, TMO 1000310, please, we come to a set of draft minutes. They appear to be a draft, because it says draft watermarked through it, of the Operations Committee of the TMO on the 2nd of May 2013. And on the first page, we can see who was present. And I just want to show you the list of presentees, the third one down being a gentleman called Peter Molyneux, council-appointed board member, and he's given the initials PM. And then in attendance, we can see Sasha Jevons, Director of Operations, and then just a little bit below, halfway down that list, you, Peter Maddison, Director of Assets and Regeneration, and you're given the initials PM and then a small a. Do you see?
Yes.
So it's to distinguish you from Peter Molyneux. Now, Janice Ray was also there as well. If we go to page 4 in this, please, I want to show you the bottom half of the page, item 10, Health and Safety Report. And it says, JW introduced the report informing the committee of the TMO's current position in relation to fire risk assessments. The report provided information on the following, and then there's a list of 6 bullet points. And the last 2 say, TMO's fire safety policy and strategy. And then the last one says, the recommendations made by the coroners following inquests on fires at Lakenal House and in Southampton, and response from communities and local government to date. And then it says, PM asked whether there is a risk to the TMO as a corporate body. JW confirmed that enforcement lies with statutory body, not us, and enforcement is still to be decided between the council and the fire brigade, but it is deemed that we are carrying out the due diligence. Now, just looking at that block of text then, First, the reference to Southampton. Were you familiar with what that was?
Yes.
What was that?
There was a fire where 2 firefighters died.
Yes, that's Shirley Towers, I think. Does that name ring a bell?
It doesn't, but...
All right. And you can see that it's JW introducing the report. That's Janice Ray, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you recall this meeting specifically?
Not specifically, no.
Right. And there's a question asked at the end by PM. That must be Peter Molyneux, not you. Is that right?
I think so.
And we can see the response. JW confirmed that enforcement lies with statutory body, not us. And enforcement is still to be decided between council and the fire brigade, but it is deemed that we are carrying out the due diligence. Am I right to think that this question was about corporate exposure? In other words, focusing on the TMO protecting itself from legal liability of some kind?
I'm assuming that this was more about the leasehold of flat entrance doors, which had been an issue which was causing some issues because of the I understand the TMO and the council didn't have right to enforce, and so that was causing some difficulties. So I suspect that minute is probably related to that specific point.
I see. So, and the question of flat front doors is the fourth bullet point down, if you look at it, to be fair to you. The current position on enforcement on potentially non-compliant leasehold of flat entrance doors within enclosed blocks and the due diligence approach the TMO has adopted whilst responsibility for enforcement is clarified. So you think that Peter Molyneux's question related to that?
I assume so. I don't recall the meeting specifically.
Right. I see. Was there any discussion about whether the TMO should follow the coroner's recommendations, regardless of whether there was any legislation that was to follow?
There was a discussion at the Health and Safety Committee regarding issues, and there was a report reported there.
Yes. Well, let's come on to that then. Can we go to your third witness statement, please, and go to page 1 and then over to the top of page 2. You say in paragraph 5 at the bottom of page 1, I'm aware that Janice Ray, the TMO's Health and Safety and Facilities Manager, produced a briefing note on the fire at Lacknell House prior to these presentations. The presentations, I should just say, you're referring to are those at the end of 2013. And you say, over the top, taking place, this presentation was considered at a Health and Safety Committee meeting that I attended. I also recall reading a report produced by the London Fire Brigade following the Shepherd's Court fire. If we go now to the TMO 100399094, please. This is a briefing note on fire at Lacknell House, Southwark. Is this the briefing note that you're referring to at paragraph 5 of your third witness statement that we've just seen?
I think so, yes.
And if we go to page 4, it's a 4-page document, we can see that Janice Ray has signed it and dated it June 2013. Does this ring a bell with you, Mr. Maddison?
I haven't seen this for a while, but I certainly recognise the first bit.
But it looks like a document you're referring to in your statement.
Yeah.
Do you think it was?
Yeah, I think it probably is.
Right. And on page 4, as you can see, Shirley Court, just towards the top of the page, Shirley Court, Southampton, fire on 6th April 2010. So it looks like the Shirley Towers fire was the Southampton fire referred to in the previous minute of the meeting in May. Do you remember when the Health and Safety Committee meeting took place that considered this document?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Right. Well, we may be able to track it down because you didn't give the date in your statement. Can we go to TMO 008 41428, please? This is a committee meeting of the TMO Health and Safety Committee, and we can see that Janice Ray is present. If you look at the second attendee down, see that?
Yes.
Now, I'm not sure that you were present. Because you're not listed as present. and it doesn't look as if you apologise for your absence either. Was it a meeting that you would normally expect to attend?
Not at this stage. When these meetings were run by Anthony Parks, my team would be represented there. So Alex Bosman and John Bora were from my team, so they attended to consider certain issues. That changed as the Health and Safety Committee meetings evolved.
Right. Now, we know that a paper was presented at this meeting because the paper we've just been looking at was attached to the agenda. And let's just trace it through. The agenda is at TMO 1003991. And you could see item 6, briefing note on Lacknell House fire circulated with agenda. You see that?
Yes.
And then the paper that's attached to the agenda is at TMO 1003994. If we can just flash that up, you'll see that that's the paper that we saw before, dated June 2013 by Janice Ray. Now, if we go to the meeting note itself, it's TMO 00841428. Go back to that. And that's the first page we were looking at a moment ago. If we jump to page 4, in that document, we look at item 6, Lacknell House. A briefing note was circulated showing a timeline for the escalation of the fatal fire at this block, and there was a discussion about the factors that contributed to the speed of fire spread. Further, the briefing note outlined the recommendations made by the coroner following the inquest, the likely impact of these, and what action the TMO should take. And then there are some specifics underneath that, which you can see there. Now, as I think have established, you weren't at the meeting. Am I right in thinking you didn't see the agenda either?
I don't think I would have done.
Can you tell us what were the circumstances in which you saw the paper that was attached to the agenda?
I think that was presented to a future Health and Safety Committee, from memory.
Right. We certainly know that it was presented much later, in 2017. Does that ring a bell with you?
I really have no recollection
Right.
of the dates, I'm afraid.
But to give you the picture, there was a prosecution of Southwark Council in 2017. And if we go to the minutes of the Health and Safety meeting of the 16th of March 2017, this is at TMO 100167739. This time we can see that you were present. You're the fourth person down immediately under Janice Ray. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it's dated the 16th of March 2017 at 10:30 a.m. And if we look at page 5 under paragraph 5.0 and 5.1, we can see Lacknell House LFB prosecution of London Borough of Southwark. The paper was discussed and it was noted we were compliant with the offences for which Southwark had been prosecuted. You see that?
Yes.
Now the agenda, if we just go to that, is at TMO 100162238. And again at item 6, against the perhaps optimistic time of 11:15, paper and appendix, Lacknell House LFB prosecution of London Borough of Southwark. See that?
Yeah.
So do you think that was the time at which you got the paper?
I really can't.
The June 2013 paper?
I've got no recollection of this, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, let's look at the email sending the agenda. It's TMO 100162229. TMO 100162229. There's the email from Janice Ray, 13th of March 2017. And it comes to you as the third recipient in the list. And you can see the list of attachments. And one of the attachments, 4 lines down in the list, if you can just cast your eye down there, Mr. Maddison. Lacknell House briefing note for H&S Com June 2013. You see that?
Yes.
So can we take it that Janice Ray's June 2013 Lacknell note was sent to you on the 13th of March 2017 as part of the agenda item for the meeting, the minutes of which we've just seen?
That looks to be the case.
Yes. Having shown you those documents, when did you think, or do you think, you first became aware of Janice Ray's Lacknell House briefing note of June 2013?
I'm afraid I really can't remember. I mean, I remember there being discussions within the TMO about the Lacknell House fire, and I can't tell when that paper specifically came to me. I don't know.
Right. Were you ever, to the best of your recollection, actually involved in the discussions about what to do about the Lacknell coroner's recommendations?
I do remember a conversation at the Health and Safety Committee, but that may have been the later one. I don't remember.
Right. When you say the later one, you
The
mean
one
the
that
one
you-
in March 2017?
Yes.
Right. Can we then go back to the briefing note, and in the light of what you told us and your recollection of it, let's see how far we get with it. TMO 100399094. You could see the first page there.
Could I see the second page?
Indeed. And if we go to the second page, well, let me just draw. Well, you've got it there now. I was going to draw some things to your attention on the first page. But we can go back to that. That is the second page. Is there anything you would want to point out?
And could I see the third page?
From it? Certainly. Page 3, please.
Okay, thank you.
Now, or rather sticking with page 3, we can see at the top of the page, first paragraph, last two sentences, it says, at the conclusion of the inquest into this fire, the coroner made a number of Rule 43 recommendations to the Department for Communities and Local Government, DCLG. These recommendations cover the following areas. Further, I have also outlined the TMO's current position / approach. And if we go towards the bottom of the page to item 4, it says, consider retrofitting of sprinklers in high-rise blocks. TMO currently, so this is the current position, recently asked the LFB to confirm where they require sprinklers to be fitted, and as yet no requirement to retrofit in high-rise blocks. A number of other landlords, most notably Southwark, have commissioned feasibility studies. However, they have confirmed that there is currently no resources to fund this. Did you know at any time between June 2017 and June 2013 and June 2017 that retrofitting sprinklers was one of the recommendations made by the coroner at Lacknell?
I was aware of that.
And when did you become aware of that?
I don't know specifically.
At latest, it would have been, I would suggest, when you received the briefing note, as we know you definitely did, in mid-March 2017.
Yes, and I certainly remember having a conversation with Janice Ray following the Southampton fire inquest in relation to sprinklers.
Right.
And we took advice from the fire brigade at that time.
I see. So you did give consideration to retrofitting sprinklers into your housing stock?
I think there was a consideration given to it, and so there was, and we had a conversation with the fire brigade, who gave certain recommendations in terms of this. There was a report back from the fire brigade saying that that Janice Ray had in relation to sprinklers, and it was a very complicated issue that hadn't been given full consideration.
That hadn't been given full consideration.
In the practical sense, in terms of how that could be designed and how that could be delivered and how it could be afforded. So there was, and the note from the fire brigade was quite wasn't saying that they specifically that we needed to install them at this stage, but it was a recommendation from the inquiry that needed some consideration.
Yes. Was the question of money a stumbling block in the decision not to retrofit sprinklers once you'd seen the Rule 43 recommendations from the coroner at Lacknell?
I don't think we ever got as far as getting a full cost of what it would be. And I think some of the other issues were the practical issues of how to do it, and so there wasn't a full considered approach to our strategy in relation to sprinklers.
Right. You see, in the note that we can see, Southwark are said to have no resources to fund the retrofitting of sprinklers. Was that the case also with RBKC or the TMO, so far as it had a need within its own housing stock?
I think this was an issue of strategy. So in a way, part of the work that I was doing when I first arrived at the TMO was to put in place an asset management strategy which set the parameters within which we would be investing in the stock, and with that we were in dialogue with the council about the level of investment needed and what the priorities were. At that time, I think we were looking at ensuring that the passive elements of fire safety were in operation, and particularly on Grenfell, the AOV there was beyond economic repair, and so the priority was really to make sure that what was there was put back in working order. And there wasn't consideration, as I can remember, when I was on the project in relation to fitting sprinklers.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not quite finished on this document, but I've got a few more questions on it. But it's probably time for a break.
Sensible point, would it?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to give Mr. Maddison the usual
Yes.
injunction, but I'll have to make an exception in relation to advice on the books, won't I?
I think that's right, Mr. Chairman.
And you'll need to speak to whoever's going to act for him in relation to that
He
matter.
will need to remain free to speak to his legal advisor, his new legal advisors,
Yes.
about the narrow issue of disclosure of the diaries
Yes.
and the notebooks, but not about their substance.
No, well, that's as it seemed to me, but thank you for confirming.
It's subject possibly to one qualification, which is the question of whether any of the substance is legally professionally privileged. I think on
Well,
that
that's a different question.
Which is a different question.
Yes.
So it's a narrow direction.
Yes. Well, Mr. Maddison, if you wonder what that was about, it is because we're about to have a short break in the proceedings, and whenever we do that, I warn the witnesses that they're not to talk to anyone else about their evidence or anything related to it. And I would normally say just that to you and leave it at that. But, of course, there is the question of the notebooks and the diaries, and we know that you're going to take advice from separate lawyers in relation to those matters. And so, of course, although you mustn't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it, you obviously must be able to talk to your new lawyers, solicitors or counsel, about the notebooks that we now know existed and why they weren't brought to our attention sooner. It's possible that there may be passages within those notebooks that you might wish to say should not be disclosed because they are what lawyers call subject to legal professional privilege. I'm not going to give you a little lecture about what that involves, but that is something which you can talk to your new lawyers about if it seems appropriate, and they will explain to you what that means. But I think I should say to you, please don't talk to your new lawyers or anyone else come to that about the substance of the contents of those notebooks. Do you understand the point I'm making? All right, well, with all that, I'm going to say we're going to have a break now. We'll come back, if you would please, at 25 to 4, and then we'll resume at that point.
Thank you.
So would you like to go to the usher, please? Thank you. Good. 25 to 4, please. Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Maddison to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Maddison, are you ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Maddison, can we go back to the document we were in, which is Janice Ray's June 2013 Lacanal note, TMO 1003994, please. Page, if we just go to page 3 in that note. At the bottom there, where we were, paragraph 4, consider retrofitting of sprinklers in high-rise blocks. You can see in the first line at the end it says, and as yet no requirement to retrofit. And my question is, to the best of your recollection, was there a decision made or a discussion about not retrofitting sprinklers in your housing stock because there was, at least as yet, no legal requirement to do so?
I don't think there was a decision of that nature made. I think it was identified as an issue, but it was a very complex issue in terms of the practicalities. And I think we probably needed to do a lot of feasibility work in terms of understanding how it could be done, right, and how much it would cost.
To what extent did the fact that sprinklers were not a legally required factor for the TMO in deciding what to do play on it in its decision making?
Well, I think the focus. I mean, can you just remind me what date?
Well, this is June. About? Yes, this is immediately after, or within a few months of the Lacanal Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations, June 2013. So about 6 months after you arrived at the TMO.
I mean, the focus really was what was detailed in the asset management strategy that was agreed with the council around that time, and that put health and safety issues as a high priority within the strategy. Yeah. But the priority at that time was really about making sure that what was currently there was compliant, and the focus hadn't really moved on to the opportunities of installing sprinkler systems at that time.
So would it be fair to say that because you didn't have to do it, you didn't do it?
I think that's a fair enough thing to say, but I think it was probably more complicated than that.
Yes, I understand it was difficult.
Issues around the feasibility and the management of those systems was problematic too.
Now, sticking with this paper, right at the very bottom, you can see item 5, review approved document B of the building regulations, clear reference to external fire spread. And over the page 4, at the top, you can see it says, whilst we cannot be sure how DCLG will respond to these recommendations, it is considered unlikely that they will make existing legislation more onerous, especially if this requires landlords to undertake significant, as yet unresourced works. Now, as to the reference to approved document B and clear reference to external fire spread there in this document, do you recognise that? Or did you, when you saw this document, recognise that as a reference to fire spread in the cladding at Lacanal House?
I certainly recognised it in relation to fire spread through the fire compartmentalisation within Lacanal House not being adequate.
Right. Do you recall that there were any discussions about the external wall build-up or exterior wall construction contributing to the fire?
Yes.
You do? Now, of course, as we know, central to the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project was the overcladding of a residential high-rise block. Did you consider that the lessons from the Lacanal House fire might be relevant to the project you were overseeing?
I don't remember a specific reference back to Lacanal House, but my focus was really on ensuring that the works that were carried out to Grenfell Tower complied with regulation.
Right.
I didn't specifically reference that back to Lacanal House.
I see. Did you ever connect the dots and think that the lessons and experiences from Lacanal House might be relevant learning points in relation to the safety of the cladding at Grenfell?
Well, I was conscious that Lacknell House and Grenfell Tower were very different constructions, and so my reference points were really more towards other similar buildings that had had similar treatment.
When you say your reference points were towards similar buildings that had had similar treatment, what are you referring to?
Well, there are a number of overclad buildings within London, and so I'd visited some of them and I'd seen them. So I'd assumed I was looking for those as reference points because they were a more similar construction than say Lacknell House was to Grenfell Tower.
Which were the buildings, or the overclad buildings in London you visited?
I'd visited. I'd been to the Chalcott estate in Camden. I'd worked in Camden not on that project specifically, so I was aware of that, and I'd visited that estate to look at the works.
When did you visit that estate?
Probably late 90s.
Late 90s?
Sorry, am I thinking? No, sorry, not late 90s. Sorry, it must have been. It was at my time when I was working at Hyde Housing Association, I remember. So
at Hyde? You were working at Hyde?
Yes.
Right.
And I went and visited that estate.
Now, that would have been before you went to the TMO?
Yeah.
Did you visit the Chalcott's estate while it was being reclad, during the recladding project?
Yes.
You did?
Yes. Certainly through the refurbishment work. I think the cladding was complete when I visited.
Right. What was your role at Hyde Housing which took you to the Chalcott's project at the stage of its refurbishment that you visited it?
I was responsible for stock transfer works, so putting together programs of work with reference to potential stock transfers from local authorities to housing association. So I managed programs of work there.
Did you meet any of the contractors or subcontractors when you visited?
I don't remember who I was there with.
You can't remember. Did you have any discussions when you visited it with any contractor or subcontractor about the cladding system?
Not specifically. It was more about the approach to complex works with residence and occupation and the management of that. It wasn't a technical review meeting. It was a reviewing approaches to complex projects.
Right. Do you remember who you spoke with or dealt with?
I remember the chief. I can't remember the name of the chief executive of the PFI, because it was a PFI project. So it was certainly there, and I can't remember who else.
Right. Are there any other overclad residential tower blocks you visited in addition to Chalcott's? Well,
there are others that I've worked on that have been overclad. Not I've visited. So there was some in Lewisham, which I was working on as part of that.
Well, we've discussed that already in your
No,
statement.
this is a different.
These are different ones, are they?
Yeah, this is. So when I was at Hyde, there were a number of tower blocks at the bottom of the Old Kent Road. I think it was Hatcham Park Estate, which had been overclad. So I worked in that as part of a potential stock transfer, but again, didn't know the nature of the material. And the contractor sort of significantly at Chalcott's estate was Ryden. Yes, they were the principal contractor for the PFI.
Indeed, they were. We know that. Who were the contractors at the Old Kent Road project? Do you think called Hatch? Is it Hatch?
Hatcham Park.
Hatcham Park.
I don't know the contract. The works were long finished when I was working on that project.
And when did you visit that project?
That was when I was at Hyde. So we were working on a potential stock transfer from the borough to Hyde Housing Association.
And just for convenience's sake, can you give us the dates you were at Hyde?
I'd say from probably 2005 to around 2010.
Right.
Um,
In fact, I think I've been reminded you were at Hyde from 2006 to 2011. That's in your first witness statement. But
that sounds right.
right, okay. And in what way was Lakanal different from the Grenfell construction? Do you know?
Well, Lakanal was more of it was a lower rise block, and it was more of a medium rise construction. And it wasn't from the photographs that I've seen. It wasn't completely overclad. It was more infill panels around window frames. So it seemed like a different construction. Whereas the construction that I'd seen on these other blocks that I didn't work on but was familiar had visited were more akin to the full envelope overcladding that you can see on Grenfell Tower.
Now, can we go forward then in time to the March of 2017 and the Health and Safety Committee meeting we looked at earlier on? We go, I think, to TMO 100162441, please. This is a further paper by Janice Ray. It's called Paper 6. And it's entitled Lakanal House Fire, London Fire Brigade Prosecution of London Borough of Southwark for Information. And it looks very much as if this was one of the agenda items, or formed part of the agenda pack, which was circulated prior to the 16th of March 2017 Health and Safety Committee meeting you attended. Is that right?
I don't know, but
right. Well, let's look. We'll come back to this in a moment. Let's just look at TMO 100162440. There is the paper, and it's now called, at the top right-hand corner, Paper 6, Appendix A. So that looks like the same paper that dated June 2013 we've just looked at. And if we go back to the second paper, TMO 100162441, about the prosecution, that's Paper 6. And if you look at the bottom, it deals with the prosecution of London Borough of Southwark, and there's a summary of what happened there. Do you remember that? Do you remember seeing this document?
I don't remember it.
You don't? Well, let's look at the minutes of the meeting then, at TMO 100167739, and see if these prompt a recollection. You can see that here are the minutes again. We looked at them before. You're there, fourth attendee down. And if we go to page 5 of the minutes and go to item 5.1, and again, I showed you this before, it says the paper was discussed and it was noted we were compliant with the offences for which Southwark had been prosecuted. Do you recall that discussion?
I don't recall that specific discussion, no.
Right. So you don't recall the discussion, and you don't recall seeing the paper of March 17 I've just shown you, which has the summary of the prosecution in it?
I just don't remember the meeting specifically. I mean, if I was there, I'm sure I'll have absorbed
Right.
it.
Do you remember to what extent the meeting reviewed the TMO's own systems and arrangements for complying with the relevant obligations under the RRO, the Fire Safety Order, in light of the fact that Southwark had been prosecuted? Do you remember anything about that?
I'm afraid I don't.
Do you know what the basis was for the note that, quotes, we were compliant with the offences for which Southwark had been prosecuted?
Sorry, I don't.
I mean, were any documents prepared and analysed so that an informed discussion about that issue could happen? Do you know?
Sorry, I don't remember the specifics of this meeting at all.
Right. Do you know who it was who had made the decision, or, if you like, observation, that the TMO was compliant with the offences for which Southwark had been prosecuted?
I don't. I assume the minutes were taken by Janice Ray.
Right.
I don't know. Sorry.
You can't help.
No.
And did you draw no connection in your mind at this stage? And I know this is March 17, so only a few months before the fire and more months after practical completion in July 2016. I appreciate that. But did you draw any connection in your mind between Lacknell House and the prosecution and Grenfell Tower?
No.
Can we then turn to other cladding fires before Grenfell? Do you have any recollection of the question of the combustibility of the cladding being discussed with you, in particular, in the context of the Lacknell House fire?
The cladding on Grenfell?
The cladding on Grenfell, yes.
No, not specifically.
Now, at the time of your appointment to the TMO in January 2013, were you aware of a history of fires in cladding in the UK?
No.
Were you aware in particular of the fire at Knowsley Heights in 1991?
No.
Or the fire at Garnet Court in Irving in 1999?
No.
What about cladding fires in high-rise residential buildings in other parts of the world, such as the UAE?
I've seen some dramatic pictures on the news.
Right, those were in 2012 and 2013. So before, and perhaps at the time you joined the TMO, you remember those, do you?
I remember coverage of those fires, but didn't have any knowledge of the materials used or the regulations to which they were built to.
Did you ever discuss those fires with anybody within the TMO?
Not that I remember, no.
What about with anyone in the Grenfell professional team?
No.
Did you have any knowledge of the Lacrosse building fire in Melbourne in 2014 when it happened?
No.
Can we then turn to the initial procurement stages for Grenfell Tower? And we start with your first witness statement, please, at page 4. And on page 4, I'd like to go to paragraph 25. You say, at the time of my appointment, the rebuilding of the Kensington Academy and Leisure Centre, CALC, was being undertaken directly by RBKC using their contractors Leadbitter, later taken over by Boog, Architect Studio E, and other contractors and consultants, including Artelia, then known as Appleyards. RBKC chose to use the same contractors and consultants for the proposed Grenfell Tower refurbishment, which they were able to do under the IESI framework agreement for public sector procurement to engage call-off contractors without the need to go out to tender. Now, the employer or client for the CALC project was RBKC, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it was RBKC that had appointed Studio E and Artelia to the CALC project.
Yes.
And also Exova as fire safety consultants to that project, yes?
I don't know.
You don't know?
No.
Right. Now, I appreciate this all happened before you started, but when you came into post in January 2013, were you told on what basis Studio E and Artelia had been appointed to the Grenfell Tower project?
I think you can see in my statement here that I was, until very recently, under the misapprehension that they were appointed under the IESI framework. It's become clear that that's not...
You say until very recently. When did you discover that that was wrong?
As I said, in the last few weeks.
During the evidence?
Yes.
I see. Can you explain how you came to be under the illusion that they were appointed under the IESI framework?
It's been reported, it had been mentioned, so I took my reference point when I arrived at the TMO from the board report that had been presented to the TMO board in January 13 before I came into post. And that had referenced that both contractor and consultants were procured through the IESI framework. And I'd also noticed in reviewing the status reports from Artelia that they also make the same reference. So I think my assumption was that they were all through the IESI framework, but now I learn that that RBKC had procured them separately, and it was just Leadbetter that were procured through the IESI framework.
Right. When you came into post, did you actually investigate? I think you told us you didn't actually investigate how Artelia and Studio E came to be on the Grenfell Tower project, as opposed to RBKC's CALC project.
No, as I say, I took my reference point from the board report, which related to their appointments.
Right, and you never challenged it or investigated it?
No. I have no reason to.
Was it your understanding that the reason why Studio E and Artelia were appointed to the Grenfell Tower project was because they had worked on the Calc project?
Yeah, I understood that that RBKC and KCTMO had been talking and understood that they wanted to explore the possibility of there being a synergy between the two projects, thought that would give better value for money through shared overhead costs, etc.
Now, if you just look in the middle of paragraph 25 of your statement, you say there, RBKC chose to use the same contractors and consultants for the proposed Grenfell Tower project. When you say RBKC chose, on what basis do you say there that it was RBKC who made that choice for the Grenfell Tower project?
I think that's probably incorrect. I think it's RBKC and the TMO were agreed together that would be a sensible route to procure the work through.
But given that the Grenfell Tower refurbishment was a TMO major works and not an RBKC project, RBKC not being the client for those works, was it their choice to make at all?
Well, the RBKC were the client and the owner of the building, so and there has been a time previously where RBKC themselves had delivered large-scale capital works rather than the TMO. So I think that there was scope to do either, and I think that, but I think that RBKC were keen to allow the TMO to manage that project. Albeit being a very large project in the scope of the level of capital works that the TMO had been delivering to that point.
You said, page 72, line 22, that it was RBKC and the TMO agreed together to appoint Studio E and Artelia being the same contractors and consultants. Why did RBKC have any role at all in making that choice, given that RBKC were not going to be the client under any of the contracts?
And I can't really comment because I wasn't involved in any of these discussions. I'm only really telling you what my assumptions were from what I've seen. I think that RBKC were the client and the owner of the building, and they worked very closely with the TMO, and albeit through the modular management agreement, but and working together to get best economies of scale and value for money seems like a sensible approach.
It sounds from what you're telling us that although RBKC might not have been the sole decision maker about the appointment of Studio E and Artelia as consultants to the Grenfell Tower project, nonetheless they had a significant decision-making role to play in that choice.
Yes, and the client, they were the client, and so the TMO would develop an asset management strategy, for example, and we would agree that with the council. So it was, the TMO worked on behalf of the council to some extent, and there was a close and clear clienting arrangement between the two parties.
You say they were the client. They were not the client in relation to the Grenfell Tower project itself.
No, they were the client in relation to the services provided by the TMO. So they were our client, and then we cliented the relationships with the contractors for the programs that we delivered.
That I follow, but the client relationship that you had with RBKC was governed entirely, wasn't it, by the MMO, which we've looked at?
And was monitored on a regular basis, and there were agreements made about how to progress certain schemes, such as Grenfell Tower.
There's nothing we've seen in the modular management agreement which entitled RBKC to join in the decision-making by the TMO in how to run and supervise major works, is there?
I don't know.
You don't know. At all events, as you say, when you came into the project, they were already retained on the Grenfell Tower project. Was it your impression that RBKC had played a significant role in the choice of appointment of Studio E and Artelia to the Grenfell Tower project?
They clearly played a role in procuring that team that was then being extended, the scope of which was then being extended onto Grenfell Tower.
Are you able to cast any light yourself on the nature or extent of the scrutiny that RBKC brought to bear on the appointment of Studio E as suitable architects for the Grenfell Tower project as opposed to Calc?
I'm sorry, I've got no insight into exactly what was happening at that time.
Were you aware that Studio E had been appointed to Calc by RBKC because of their specialist experience with schools and leisure centres?
I didn't.
Were you aware that Studio E had no experience of high-rise refurbishment projects like Grenfell
I wasn't.
and had never done an overcladding project?
Well, Calc was an overclad project, so my experience with Studio E was that they were delivering a complex and large programme right next door to Grenfell Tower, and it was overclad. So I'd expect that they'd had a degree of understanding of the complexities of that sort of project.
But did you know that they'd had no experience of overcladding a high-rise residential block?
I didn't know that.
Had you known that, had that been something you'd learnt on arriving at the TMO, would you have looked with greater scrutiny at whether they were really fit to do the job?
I think that, as the scheme it was already at stage D by the time I arrived, and the only design work and development of that design that took place pre-contract was to take that to stage E. There was a limited amount of interface I had with the professional team other than mobilising them and focusing them on doing that. Really, the decision comes further down the line in terms of at which point which contractor we procure to take on the design post-contract. And that was really where my focus was on ensuring that we did get contractors who had the right experience and would give them proper due diligence.
Can I then turn to Artelia? Now, we start, I think, by looking at their contractual roles. We heard from Simon Cash in this inquiry recently that there was a contract between the TMO and Artelia, which was agreed in the August of 2012. When you came into the project in the following January, do you remember that that was a feature or a fact you became familiar with?
I was aware they were appointed. The terms of the appointment weren't very clear to me.
And were you aware of the precise roles which Artelia had agreed to perform at that time?
There was a bit of confusion around that. Sometimes there was different names, different job roles were interchanged within various correspondence. So sometimes in my statements I've referred to them as project managers, for example. Whereas actually, so there was a bit of ambiguity because in some of their reports they would refer to themselves as project managers, where in fact that probably just relates to the member of staff's job description rather than the role that they were performing.
Indeed. Now that sense of ambiguity you've just been telling us, is that a sense that you've developed since hearing the evidence, or was it something you knew at the time?
No, it was, and I think it's quite well documented that I spent some time trying to fathom out quite what the basis of the appointments were and resolving them going forward, really.
Well, let's then take it in stages. Can you go to your second witness statement, please, at paragraph 10A and 11 on page 3. You say in paragraph 10A, and we need to read the opening words to that. The pre-contract professional team for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project consisted of, and then you put out a list. A, Artelia Projects UK Limited, Artelia, as the CDM coordinator, employer's agent, and quantity surveyor. And then at paragraph 11, you say, in my earlier statement to the inquiry, I referred to Artelia as the contract administrator stroke project manager. However, having reviewed that statement to produce this supplementary one, I believe the description given above is more accurate. So that's a correcting statement. When you started, what role did you understand Artelia to be fulfilling?
Because they'd referred to themselves in documents as project managers, I'd assumed that was the terminology that was being used under the IEASY framework. So I made an assumption that that was the role. They were very Artelia were very active in pulling together and coordinating the various roles across the professional team. And I think that led me to my understanding that they were project managers rather than employers' agents, quantity surveyors, and CDM coordinators.
I see. So you thought they were project managers not because they'd signed something saying project manager, but because they were doing a lot.
They were doing project management, yes.
Right. And now looking at the three categories of service that they were agreeing to provide, which you described in paragraph 10A here, was that always your understanding? They were always CDM coordinator, employer's agent, and quantity surveyor.
Well, not necessarily. I don't necessarily know, because part of that would be determined by the form of procurement and the procurement route that we went to. So but this was certainly, once the procurement route that was agreed to tender the works, these were the appointments that mirrored that appointment.
Yes. Well, we'll come back to the question of project manager shortly. But when you came into the project in the January of 2013, did you understand that Artelia at least occupied these three roles: CDM coordinator, employer's agent, and quantity surveyor?
Yeah.
You did. Then we move on to their role in design. Can we look at your first witness statement, please, at page 4? And I'd like to go to paragraph 23, at the top of the page there. You say there, and I'll pick it up in the third line, there was no requirement for me to have that technical knowledge, that's about cladding, as these matters were very much the responsibility of the principal designer, Studio E, and the contract administrators stroke project managers, Artelia, who had responsibility for developing the design to tender stage. The principal contractor then took responsibility post-tender into the construction phase to ensure compliant materials were used in a compliant way. Now, just focusing on your words, Artelia, who had responsibility for developing the design to tender stage there. See that? I just want you to keep that in mind and then look at something else you say, also in your first witness statement, but this time at page 12, if we can go to page 12, and look at paragraph 66. You say there, Ryden was selected via their tender submission because of their experience, etc. And then 4 lines down you say, it was the responsibility of Artelia to check compliance and for John Rowan and partners who were engaged as clerk of works to check and inform TMO of any non-compliances in the installation. Just focusing on the words, it was the responsibility of Artelia to check compliance. Just picking up on those words and the words in the previous section I read to you, responsibility to develop the design. Can you clarify what responsibility for design you thought Artelia had?
Could you just take me back to that reference, please?
Well, you've got that one there in front of you at 66, and the earlier one is at paragraph 23 on page 4.
If I could see that bit.
Yes, certainly. And it's 3 lines up from the end of the paragraph. Artelia, who had responsibility for developing the design to set...
Yeah, that's an incorrect statement.
Right.
All right. So Studio E had responsibility for developing the design to tender stage, not Artelia. Artelia were employers' agents who were working on the client's behalf to manage that relationship with the contractor.
Do you accept that Artelia had in fact excluded responsibility for the design and selection of materials?
At which stage?
Well, it's a fair question back to me. They'd expressly done so in their July 2014 written contracts.
Sorry, I'm struggling to. In relation to, their appointments going forward. So this is in relation to managing the relationship with the main contractor.
Let's try it slightly differently. You've accepted that the words Artelia, who had responsibility for developing the design to tender stage, is wrong.
Yes, Studio E had that responsibility.
And you explained why.
Artelia had responsibility for, as employer's agent, for ensuring that the post-works, the main contractor took and complied with the terms of their employer's requirements.
You mean the post-tender
Yes.
contractor
Yes.
complied with the terms of their employer's requirements.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you explain how you came to make the error that you now accept is there? Why did you think when you wrote this statement that Artelia had responsibility for developing the design to tender stage?
I'll tell you, it's clear that Artelia's responsibilities was in relation to employers' agents, and while not having necessity to oversee the design, I would expect an employer's agent to be working with the principal designer and taking, but also with in their employer's agent role, but also as their CDMC role to ensure that that qualified designers were carrying out those works and were complying with the terms of their contracts.
Right, I follow. So we read your words there, responsibility for developing the design, not as a primary responsibility to develop the design itself, but to oversee the adequate development of the design.
As our agent, yes.
As your agent?
Yes.
Yes, I see. Can we then turn to the role of Artelia as lead consultant and go to your second witness statement at page 8, please? And at paragraph 38, you say at the bottom of the page there, with a direct contract then in place between Ryden and Studio E, Artelia remained in the role of employer's agent to the TMO, and it is my understanding that in this sense it took on a de facto role as the TMO's lead consultant in relation to the professional team that the TMO retained. By professional team that the TMO retained, your expression there, what do you mean, or who do you mean?
Well, the only consultants that we retained were Max Fordham in relation post contract. So really, their role was our employer's agent. They were our agent, ensuring that the main contractor complied with the terms of their appointment.
I see. So you're talking about being leader of those professionals who remain direct appointments or appointees of the TMO.
Yes, although in reality, that was primarily themselves. I mean, they were we retained Artelia as employer's agent to manage the main contract with Ryden.
To be clear, you're not saying that Artelia was the lead consultant for the whole project?
I mean, again, they make reference to themselves as lead consultant in various documents, and so that was. But my understanding now, having looked at the appointments, that Studio E were the lead consultant in the pre.
Well, when you say my understanding now, having looked at the appointments, that Studio E were the lead consultant, is that an understanding that you've arrived at since the inquiry started?
No, I think I felt that at the time.
You did?
So, so when we were looking to reinvigorate the project and remobilise it, Artelia took an active role in coordinating the appointments, agreeing the services from the various members of the professional team. So, and in some of that correspondence with those parties referred to themselves as the lead consultant. Now, that may not have been reflected in the appointments, but it was certainly how they acted in reality.
Now, Simon Cash said that the lead consultant was a role leading the design team, and Artelia excluded that role. Do you remember that?
No, I didn't.
You don't? Well, if you like, we can look at the contract from 2014 where that role was clearly excluded. Do you not recall that?
I wasn't heavily involved in the drafting of that contract, so
right. Did you not look at it?
I don't remember if I have.
Did you not know that Artelia had expressly excluded the role of lead consultant when it came to formalising the relationship?
As I say, I recognise they weren't the lead consultant, but they took a lead on certain aspects of the work.
So can we take it from what you've just said is that you did know always that Artelia were not the lead consultant in a formal role leading the design team?
No, they were employers' agents responsible for
Right.
managing our contract with Ryden.
I see. And that therefore, because they were not the lead consultant, Artelia did not have responsibility, to your way of understanding, for design or checking compliance themselves.
No, other than their responsibilities for ensuring that Rydens have taken due regard to ensure that because the principal responsibility here for design post-tender is with Rydens, and so we are expecting our employers' agents to take due steps to make sure that they are complying with those obligations.
Now, I want to come back then next to the role as project manager that Artelia did or didn't occupy. Can we go to your first statement at page 4, please? And look at paragraph 23. We've looked at this before. And you say there, and you've already addressed this a little bit, I think, that, or you seem to suggest that Artelia were appointed as project managers of the construction. That's the suggestion that you make there. If we look at your second statement, can we go to your second statement, please, at paragraph 11 on page 3? You say, and again I've shown you this, that you believe the description is more accurate when you say that they were the employer's agent, QS and CDMC. You, I think, do accept that Artelia were not contracted to perform the role of project manager.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, it does appear that you weren't entirely sure of that when you wrote your first statement. When you wrote your first statement, had you not read Artelia's contract terms, either those that applied when you started at the TMO in 2013 or those which were agreed in the summer of 2014?
At that time, I didn't have access to that
Right,
document, but I took those references from various correspondence from Artelia.
I'll follow. Let's see if we can round this topic off fairly quickly then. We may be able to do that in light of what you've just told us. Can we look at ART 401219, please? This is a document entitled Draft Revised Brief at June 2013 for Grenfell Tower. And on the first page, we can see that you are identified as the project sponsor. Does this mean that this document was directed to you?
I don't recall. I think it was. Yes. Well, it was directed to the team that I led.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Do you remember receiving it?
Yes.
Did you read it?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we look at page 2? At the fourth paragraph from the top of that page, it says, the design team who have been involved with the project to date will remain appointed and will continue through to project completion. Previous plans to novate all designers to the principal contractor are to be reviewed. Appleyards, who had previously acted as EA/QS, will take on a full PM/EA role in addition to their QS responsibilities and will fulfil the lead consultant role. Do you recall that Artelia proposed to act as full project manager and lead consultant at that time?
I don't specifically recall it, but I recollect that this was the start of a process that Appleyards and staff within my team started to work on the details of the appointments because it had been ambiguous in some areas, and this was a first stab at starting to pull that together.
I see. So do you agree that at this stage, June 2013, there needed to be a designated project management by a professional?
Not specifically, no. There was, I think that was this was an initial proposal as to how this might be done, but I think that there was a bit of an iterative process that we went through in establishing what roles were required. There was a client-side project manager who was within my team, but that wasn't taking on the professional roles, and the professional roles were led going forward by Appleyards or Artelia as they became as an employer's agent, CDMC and quantity surveyor.
Can I just show you what Philip Booth of Artelia said about this? Can we please go to his transcript for day 49 at page 128? And he's shown this document by Miss Grange, and at line 24, he says, so this is in the early part of me being involved still with the handover, and the project was in, we can go over the page, a sort of a bit of a state of distress, and we were reforming through our status report around that sort of time as well in April and June. What was the project? Because it had a kind of hit a wall and wasn't getting anywhere. So there were a number of things that were being reviewed with the client, TMO, as to how to reform the project to make sure, we could move it forward. And we prepared a short-term action plan. There were times when we were reviewing who was doing what, and you've refreshed my memory there. I think, evidently at one point we were talking about being the PM or the lead consultant, but we actually didn't end up doing that in terms of appointment. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's the sort of iterative process I was talking about earlier.
And do you agree that at the time the project was in a bit of a state of distress?
I think the project had stalled for a variety of reasons, so it needed to be given focus as to what the principles were and the priorities were going forward. At that time, there had been some challenges and issues around the design and the planning permission. The negotiations with the contractor had been difficult, and I think that this was part of a refocusing within the professional team to push the project forward.
Can we then go to ART 409106, please? These are the minutes of a meeting held on the 6th of June 2013, produced by Artelia, and we can see that you and David Gibson and Paul Dunkerton are there from the TMO, with Simon Cash and others from Artelia. If we go to the item 1.1 on the first page, just a little bit lower down on the screen, approval of revised project brief. PB presented the draft, it's Philip Booth, presented the draft revised project brief. It was agreed to insert overall project costs, including fees and surveys, not just construction costs. Subject to the proposed changes, the brief was approved. Now, that tells us that the revised project brief we've just seen was formally approved. Is that correct?
What date was this?
This is the 6th of June 2013. And it's referring to the draft revised project brief, which is the document, I think, unless I'm wrong, we've just seen.
Are you asking me in relation specifically to the professional team and the roles of the professional?
What I'm asking you really is it right that subject to the proposed changes about inserting overall project costs, fees and surveys, subject to that, the draft revised project brief was formally approved?
I don't recall. I mean, I haven't read the project brief in detail for some time, and it doesn't, but I can't remember.
Right. I mean, have you any reason sitting here to think that that minute is wrong?
Doesn't occur to me, although, I think there was a bit of an iterative process that was not formalised until we made the formal appointments.
Right.
And I think that's probably the brief, as it was written then, may have evolved further. I don't think this is saying that it was written, it was set in stone at this time.
Philip Booth said in his evidence that, in fact, this proposal wasn't taken up. Is that your recollection?
I think when we look at the actual appointments, I think that's true. That wasn't they weren't the appointments that were made. They were appointed as employers' agents, CDMC, etc.
Do you remember whether there was any further discussion with Artelia about Artelia performing the role of project manager and lead consultant in or after June 2013, but before July 2014?
Between June 13. The lead consultant role. So, I mean, in a way, the way the project was remobilised was to appoint. Artelia worked with Jenny Jackson in my team, I remember, to refine and define the roles that were required going forward to get the project to stage E, at which point the project was going to go out to tender. So really, this was about focusing the roles required for that project, and then beyond that, there are a set of appointments which are required to deliver that project. So that's my recollection of the way the process worked.
I think the answer to my question is no. There was no further discussion about Artelia performing the role of project manager or
yes, I think
or lead consultant.
Yes.
Right. Can we just go back then to Philip Booth's evidence at day 49, page 129, and just pick up where we broke off from it? Day 49, page 129, please. And I'd like to go to line 16. He says there, I mean, in terms of who is the right person to fulfill the role of project manager, I actually think it rightly sat on the client side, because the wider scheme of responsibility for a project manager was going to be largely around, for this project, the complications for this project. So like the resident liaison, lots of communication within all the other departments within the TMO. So I actually think it sat correctly in-house as a client side. Do you agree with that?
I think this is about clarity about the definition of the client-side project manager, who has a role for working with the employer's agent or the lead consultant on developing the brief and managing that project. Their roles are really around the internal communications and working with the repairs teams and the internal teams, external communications with residents and others, and also monitoring the contract in terms of cost and programme, etc. But it's the technical aspects of the team of this project were delivered through the professional team, who were led by, well, in the post-contract phase was led by Artelia.
It sounds from,
agent.
I'm so sorry. Do you want to continue?
As employer's agent.
It sounds from your answer to my question that you agree with Phil Booth's evidence that I've just read to you there.
With one caveat being that the project management role isn't it's not managing the technical aspects of the employees, managing the delivery of the employee's requirements by the main contractor. The project management role is a client-side monitoring, brief, stakeholder engagement, governance type role, whereas the actual managing of the project is going forward from the client side is through the employer's agent, and ultimately the project manager is delivered through the main contractor.
So, to summarise, is this how you understood it, at least from, let's say, June 2013, when this was discussed, and certainly after July 2014, when the contract was entered into, that on the client side there was a project manager, namely Claire Williams, who was there to manage the client side of things, such as residence liaison, but not a technical project manager role in the sense of running or running the project. And on the professional side, you have Artelia as employer's agent and everything within the scope of their contract.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you. When, and there are a lot of documents I could show you, but when people used the term project manager or assistant project manager, and we can see some of the Artelia people doing that, what did you understand that meant?
I think probably ultimately a lot of the people involved in this project were project managers in one sense or another, but in terms of the contract, they were providing different roles. For example, a project manager who's from Artelia, maybe the employer's agent in reality.
Right. So did you draw in your mind at the time a distinction between their job title within the organisation they were employed by and the role of project manager on the project?
I think any confusion that I had around this was my initial lack of clarity around the source of the procurement. And I think going forward, it became clear to me because I was looking for this to be delivered through a very clear traditional design and build process, which has very clearly defined roles of employer's agent, quantity surveyor, and CDMC, for example.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of this line of questioning, and
Yes.
it's also just gone 4:30, so
Yes,
that's a
that's
convenient
a
moment.
very
for
good
2
point
minutes.
at which to break for the day.
Thank you.
Yes, well, Mr. Maddison, we're going to break there for the day. I'm afraid I have to ask you to come back to answer some more questions tomorrow, but I think you were probably expecting that. And let me just repeat what I said earlier, not to talk about your evidence or anything related to it to anyone else while you're out of the room, apart from the exception that I explained to you earlier on.
Of course, thank
All
you.
right? Thank you very much. Would you like to go to the usher then, please? Okay. Good. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please. Yep.